everybody. Thank you for attending today. We appreciate you coming. We're very excited. This is our third webinar in our RTI series. Today we're going to be talking about simple documentation and data collection strategies. What I'd like to do first is introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Pam Bruening. She's with CEO and President of Progressive Bridges. It's an educational services provider. And Jay Burcham, President of Leafs, would be with us today, but he's very ill with that flu that's going around the United States, and so I'm going to be stepping in and talking a little bit about his part, but we wish him much better. So let's just get started so we don't waste everybody's time. Pam, do you want to talk about these questions?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Julia. Let's talk about some of these related questions. When we sent out a survey to our listener base, these are some of the questions that were asked about this topic, about documenting and collecting behavior data. So what is the difference between baseline data, data collection for intervention, and ongoing progress monitoring? There are some differences, so we're going to discuss that today. How could you complete simple documentation and data collection, especially when you're teaching? And what kind of data is used for data collection between tiers?
All right. Well, let's talk about that on the data.
Right. On this data slide, you'll see that there are lots of different types of data, and you'll see those over along the right-hand side of the screen. There's discipline data, and we're talking, of course, about behavior-related data. And you notice as you look at this that sometimes it's a number, like a count. Sometimes it's a time segment. Sometimes it's just an observation that you've seen things. Sometimes it's a formal assessment or a rubric of some kind, or office discipline referrals. So we have many different types of data. So understanding what kind of data to use for what is probably the most challenging part of behavior intervention.
Great. I believe that would be true. Pam, I've noticed on this next slide it looks like our Tier 2 is missing.
Right, it does look like that, and the reason I put the slide in is just to remind us that anytime we're talking about intervention, we want to always remember Tier 1, the importance of Tier 1, and that we want to be sure that if our Tier 1 is healthy and everything's working well, whether it's behavior or academics, that would mean that at least 80% of our students are being successful in that specific area. So I'm saying that only because when we think of intervention, we really need to think about all three tiers, Tier 1, 2, and 3, and the fact that we should always, if we can, provide students with support in Tier 1. And if it's good, if many students, if more than 21% of students are needing special support, that means really that all of our students probably could benefit from that special support. And this way we balance things out so we don't use up all our resources on the majority of the students. And again, you'll see with Tier 2 and 3, we put those together because those would be the tiers of resources that are needing some very specific support beyond what everyone does in Tier 1.
That's some great considerations. So let's move on to our next slide and talk about this one a little bit.
Okay, well, we can't talk about data collection or intervention without talking about problem solving, because really this process it helps us, it guides us in what data we need to use, what we need to look at, and there are different types of data that we're going to look at all along the way. So again, the process, just as a quick review, is to define the problem and then analyze why is this problem occurring, create an intervention plan, and before we move to evaluate results and before we even start our intervention plan, we want to also create a monitoring plan so we can watch the intervention along the way and determine when we're going to monitor, how we're going to monitor. And then it leads us to sort of an evaluation at the end to say, did this intervention work? For whom did it work, and for whom did it not? And who needs what, and what are our next steps? So let's look at some of the data. If you're defining the problem, one way you can determine, is this a problem for all students or for most students, or is it just a problem for a few or some, is to really take a look at your trends in data and take a look at your baseline data. Baseline data will tell you where you're starting from so that you can set an appropriate goal for intervention on where you would like to end up. And it also, again, further defines the problem for us. As you're analyzing the problem, you want to look at data trends to see, has this been a problem in the past? Has this been a problem last year? And if there's a trend in when these problems occur, and perhaps that will lead to an intervention that we can put into place to make things better. As you look at creating the intervention and the monitoring plan, you want to think about the degree of the problem again. Who does it impact? Who needs the intervention? Where will this take place? What will we do as part of the intervention? And again, the degree of the problem will help us know that. And then as we move toward intervention monitoring data, again, measuring. We have baseline data. We need very similar data to check as we're measuring, is this intervention making a difference or not as we go through, and hopefully it is. And then the ongoing progress monitoring is really that big progress monitoring that we do with all students all the time, like perhaps numbers of referrals. We kind of pay attention to that all year long with students for behavior.
It's a great way of looking at it. I think our next slide gives us a little bit more data as well.
Yes, and you can see at the top that we're still asking ourselves the question, is Tier 1 effective with 80% of our students? And the reason, again, for that is so that we're not trying to use up all our resources in trying to impact half of our student body, when really if we did something for the whole student body, that would probably impact the half that needs the support. And we're not wasting that individualized data. We're also asking ourselves, is the student responding positively to the intervention? And before we even start, how can we actually measure this intervention? So the steps there are pretty much the same steps we saw in the last slide. They're just in numerical order rather than in that circle framework. But it gives you an idea of how to go through that process.
That's always great information, and everybody learns different, so it's nice to see it differently like that. Do you have an example for us?
Yes, I put an example here of Middle School B, and this is a true story. This is a middle school who, when they were working at defining a problem, discovered that students engage in horseplay during class changes. And that sounds pretty typical for any middle school.
Yeah.
But one of the things they really wanted to do is put that to an end. Some of those horseplay incidents were turning into fights and so forth, and so that was obviously not conducive to learning in their environment. So in order to define the problem, they really had to create a baseline. And I've heard many teachers say along the way, and administrators, well, they all do it. All those 7th graders horseplay between class changes. And it's easy to feel that way when you see it quite often. So what they had to really take a look at was who was doing the horseplaying and how often were those things occurring. Was it a lot of students? Was it all students? Or was it just a few? And what they did was when they went back and really observed and kept track, they noticed that really, and they did it in a very specific manner. They observed 10 class changes, different times of the day, and counted horseplay referrals. That's the only thing they were looking for through those class changes. Only 10 students had engaged in horseplay more than one time. So what they decided was those were the 10 students that really needed the intervention in this case. So now we know, or they knew, that it had to be more of a Tier 2 intervention. It wasn't all kids. It was these 10 that really needed to have that support. So they've defined the problem. As they went on to analyze the problem, we always want to ask ourselves, why is this problem occurring and what should we do about it? So the hypothesis would say something like, if these 10 students were taught how to socialize without engaging in horseplay during this class changes, the problem would decrease. And this step is a very important step because it leads us really into what we should do for the intervention. If you go to the next slide, Julia, we'll see what they actually did. In the intervention, they had any students that were engaging in 2 or more documented incidents of horseplay join a council for lunch every day for 3 weeks, during which time they used LEAPS. They were LEAPS users to teach appropriate behaviors about how to socialize with each other. They started with respect and a classroom challenge, and you guys know the classroom challenge tool is really 3 questions, and they used those questions then to help determine which LEAPS lessons would be taught during that 3-week period of time. Then they created their monitoring plan, and they decided on a weekly count of number of horseplay occurrences per student. Again, why did they decide on that? Well, because that's what they used for their baseline. So they decided that they would know if the intervention was working if that number had decreased. When they went to evaluate the results, and now this again is after they've completed the intervention, the 3-week intervention, the first time with these 10 students, they assessed the overall results. they determined that the intervention was effective for 9 out of 10 students, which was at least 80%. Obviously, that's 90%. And there was one student who still needed more support. So that student was going to work individually with someone else to try to get their behavior in check. One thing they decided when they thought about next steps was really thinking about, well, you know, this intervention was effective. We know that there'll be other students who come through or decide to horseplay at any given time because it is middle school and that's a typical thing. So they kept the intervention available so that any students that received 2 or more referrals for horseplay were automatically put in to that intervention for a 3-week period of time. And what they found over a period of time throughout a year was that by the end of that year, they really didn't have a problem with horseplay on their campus because several students had gone through and had adjusted their behavior accordingly. So I give that as an example because, again, it is a true story, and that's really how simple it is. That's really how we problem solve and how we use data. It doesn't need to be fancy, really, but you know, we just need to think through the things logically.
That's a great story. Thank you, Pam. I think on our next one we're going to talk about which data, how often, data for changing tiers.
Right. And, you know, I've heard that question many times, Julia, but there really isn't a specific data for changing tiers because, again, it's all going to depend on the problem, why, you know, how often it's occurring and your intervention and all of those things. As you just saw, they had LEAPS data available for that intervention, but they chose to use numbers of incidents of horseplay as their data to determine whether or not it was working. So there is no one right answer to exactly which data is used for changing tiers. The thing that we really need to keep in mind to answer that question, though, is we want to intervene. We want to make sure, first of all, any intervention we do was definitely working for at least 80% of the students involved. Like our example, it was. So even though the one student needed more support, that would be a key or a clue to maybe having to change to a different tier of support for that one student who still didn't do very well with the horseplay thing. So he was going on to a more intensive one-on-one support in that situation. Again, that's a good example, but there is no magic answer for that. It just takes common sense. It may be, though, it's very common too sometimes where we try an intervention and it works for half the kids, but it doesn't work for the other half. And if that's the case, we need to try another intervention for that same tier because, again, Fidelity will tell us it didn't work for more than 50%, then maybe it wasn't the best intervention. It did work for some, but it wasn't the best one, and we need to have those other 50% have the opportunity in a different way. Well, I hope that answers your question.
I think it does. I think that's a great answer and good things for people to remember. You know, on our next slide, I just want to talk a few minutes about the LEAPS Classroom Challenge tool that you referred to earlier. It is a great tool. It is your Tier 1 tool. And, you know, you can go in and you can pick that theme and just answer those 3 questions. And it's a very simple tool to use. And once you've answered those 3 questions, you get a set of recommended lesson plans based on that theming that you're doing with your kids and the way that you're working with it. Those of you that are LEAPS licensees, I'm sure, have used that. And those of you that have never seen this before, if you have questions, be sure to give us a call. But you can go in and you can actually save this challenge, and then you'd be able to come back to it on a regular basis and make notes on it. So then when you're done, you've got a fully printed report showing that you've got that Tier 1 done. You've documented that, so you can do some of that baseline and that trending. So that's just one of those tools that we had just wanted to share with you that you have in order to collect the data and track that within your LEAPS license. Additionally, within LEAPS, you've got that one-on-one assessment tool. You can use that for your Tier 1 as well, so you can get some of those benchmarks, because once you've gone through and done that assessment, and this one I'm showing you is the informant, which can be done online by somebody else. We've got the other 2, the self and the interview assessment. But once you have that data, you can go through and you can collect that. You get the fully printed report showing you all of the different information along with the set of recommended lesson plans that you're able to use. And then you can come in and you can come back after you've taught your lessons and do some more data collection by reassessing the kids. And down here on the right-hand side, you've got your pre and post graphs. But I'm going to let Pam talk a little bit more about what are some other ways you can measure behavior.
Right. One of the ways that we show up at the top part of your screen is with a behavior rubric, and you'll see that there are a plethora of ways listed right here, but the behavior rubrics and LEAPs are all found at the top of every one of these boxes. They're all correlated with the behavior lessons, and there are several usually for each one of the lessons, because we know that how a child shows that in class may be slightly different. So respect for others, for example, may include respect for peers, and then a different rubric for respect for authority, and another rubric for respect for self, and so forth. So these tools are here for you to help measure how, through the time that you're doing the intervention and afterwards, how are the students taking what they're learning from LEAPs, and then in the classroom applying those things with the behavior rubric. So over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the rubric, or one of them, and if you look closely, you'll see that there are numbers. There's great flexibility in using this. You can just print it right out. The directions are right there. You can use it for once every hour. You can use it for once a day if that's what's needed. You can use it for every period if that's what's needed. And there's a place for parent signature at the bottom. Again, how we measure behavior is really going to depend upon the behavior and the where this takes place and how we're looking at that behavior. So again, it might be the number of verbal cues required to get somebody back into compliance, or a time frame. That would be more for maybe time on task, or time working independently, or something like that, where you actually measure with a timer or a clock. The number of occurrences of something, the rubric, as we talked about, self-rating. Of course, we want to move our students in that direction if we can. Checklist of behaviors and those types of things. And again, the pre and post shows us a large measure, but most of these other things show us small measures of time, and that's what we really need for progress monitoring.
That's great. Thank you, Pam. That's always informational. Our next one is a question that we had is, how can a teacher collect behavior data while they're teaching?
Yes, and that's a very challenging thing. I think one of our other questions was even, why do we even need to do this? But we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
When I was teaching, and I still do teach, I use, if I'm collecting behavior data on a whole class, I might use some of the techniques listed on the left-hand side. Anything that makes it easy. For me, it depends on what I'm going to be doing in the classroom. Am I going to be moving around the room, or am I going to be standing more at the front during that time? So if I'm moving around, I use a clipboard more, or my cell phone actually, to add notes and points and so forth. If I'm working with individual students, and really it's only one individual or a few individuals within the classroom that I want to keep track of behavior on for some reason, I might use a tally sheet at their place, or on my attendance list, or a sticky note, or something like that. And one of the things I want to mention is, we're not just collecting behavior about challenging behavior. We might be collecting behavior related to how students are responding to our instruction. So even in a college classroom, for example, I watch my students' behavior as they work in groups to see who is not engaged, to also see who I think did the work before they came to class, and something, those types of things. So I'm always collecting. That's all behavior data, but it helps us inform our instruction, and really that's the bottom line of why we collect behavior data, is to inform our instruction, and then of course to support our students.
Great. Those are some great ideas, and I'm sure that people will use those as they go along. So let's talk about, can you collect data on students who are not officially being tested?
Yes, absolutely. And like I just kind of gave that example in a regular classroom or college classroom, my college classroom, we always collect data. That's part of what we do. A lot of it's observational, but if we are using tally marks and things like that, we're using that data to inform instruction, and we should be using that data to inform instruction. We should be collecting data in that way, and that includes behavior data. So we don't need any special permission to collect data in that manner. It's part of classroom instruction.
That's great information. Thank you, Pam. Well, this brings our webinar to an end, but I want to say again, Jay is not here, but he always does say, and I want to just, talk a little bit about what he would want to say to you, that it's important to be proactive to collect data in your classroom. Pam, do you want to say anything else about that as well?
Yes, that's right. Well, it's one of the things I always like when Jay says that with teachers is he always mentions that we're going to be using time to spend with them on behavior anyway. How we use that time is totally up to us. We're either going to be proactive and collect data as we teach, or we're going to be doing it on the reactive end when we're assigning detention and writing referrals and dealing with disruption and all of those things. And I know for myself as a teacher, I would much rather be proactive than the reactive part.
Great. That's always good information. But we hope Jay gets better. And Pam, we appreciate you being here. And again, Pam is President and CEO of Progressive Bridges, which is a educational services provider, and her information is right there for you to contact her. And again, we're with LEAPS, and if you have some questions or would like to become a LEAPS licensee or just need some help with your LEAPS account, give us a call. We do appreciate your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again with our next webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.